So I'm going to talk about skill and questionnaire development. My little experience with skill and questionnaire development mainly um, span my uh, span my duration when I was doing my master's program, and also some little bit of experience when I was working as a research manager last year at Clcd. So I'm sharing these experiences with you, and then we'll talk more about this. For those of you who benefit from it, and I heard some of you are still in your PhD programs and your master's programs, I believe this will benefit you greatly. And those who are yet to begin this or have ambitions um, for master's or PhD programs, or are in any organization that requires that is great skills to understand phenomena, this will also benefit you greatly. So I'm hoping that we would have a very great time today. So what do I have on the agenda? So I'll start with a brief background about what measurement essentially is and why it is useful. I would then go on to the steps for skill development, which I borrow heavily from a publication by Boatin et al. I'll show it to you briefly. And then I'll talk about CLCD's work, who are Bluebird with, which we worked on, or data was collected on 2 years ago, and then it was only recently that we completed the analysis and submitted it for publication. So hopefully to come out soon, and then we can also have a read of it and know what is pertaining in this area of research. So brief by way of learning objectives. So I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation, we would at least be acquainted with some of the steps involved in developing a skill in the social environment. I'm assuming that all of us here are from this field, either public health, psychology, etc. We are also hoping that I'm also hoping that by the end of this presentation, we'll learn a little bit about how we apply some of these steps to CLCD's work in creating or developing the stigma tool. Okay, so what is essentially measurement? So there are various ways and approaches that phenomena are actually measured in the sciences. And if you think about the sciences, think about the physical sciences, and just have an idea of how how phenomena in the physical sciences are measured. And I'll come back to that, right? By way of definition, measurement simply involves associating numbers or quantifying a phenomenon. So where you have a phenomenon in the environment or in your reality, and you want to measure it, you want to associate some numbers to it so that you can count it and understand, okay, maybe this person or this entity has more of this quality or less of this quality. So when you think about any phenomenon, you can think about the weight of a person, where we use measuring scales, people stand on it and then they measure their weight, right? So we have numbers and we can tell, okay, maybe I'm gaining too much weight, maybe I'm gaining or I'm just below weight and I need to ramp up my weight, or I need to lose weight because this is what this instrument is telling me. And 2 years ago, this was a very popular tool, measuring tool as well, the thermometer gun, where you enter any shop and then you have your security guards pointing guns at you to measure your temperature, because they wanted to be sure that you don't have, or you're not at risk of COVID. And we saw this working out a lot in 2 years ago. So thermometer is also another measuring tool that is used to measure temperature, right? And then for those constructors around amongst us, and also for construction work and any other type of work, we also use the tape measure to also get the dimensions of any object or any length that we are interested in. So tape measure is also used, and you can see from there that there are some numbers on it that will indicate, okay, this is the amount, this is how tall something is, or this is the length of something, right? Or even the width of this thing, right? And lastly, we have the stethoscope. How do you pronounce this? stethoscope. Yes, that's a word, right? So this is used to also by, especially in the medical profession, to measure the heart rate, and doctors are able to tell whether the heart is beating properly or the rate of the heart, and any other anomaly that is in the detected from this is captured, and then interventions are given. So measurement is key, especially in the sciences. And so, because social sciences also borrows heavily from methods from the sciences, we also need to also measure some of the phenomena that we we are interested in, right? So in social sciences too, we have our own measures, right? Our measures are broadly called scales, and scales are a set of items that are designed to measure one or more underlying latent construct. A latent construct is just behaviors and feelings and actions which cannot be directly observed. So we need the items or a set of items to be able to measure this phenomenon. So when you think of behavior or feelings or actions, you can think of anything from stigma to mental health, depression, anxiety. You can think of attitudes towards something. You can think of medication adherence. So any phenomenon that is occurring, and as a scientist you're interested in, you want to be able to measure it. You want to be able to quantify how much a particular person is responding to these behavioral feelings. And in social sciences, we use scales, we develop scales to be able to do this, right? Scales are very, very costly and time consuming because the processes can be laborious. You can take you so many years to get it right and get it done correctly, right? And it involves a lot of statistical analysis, right? So for our quanti lovers here who are very, very less knowledgeable about quantitative methods, don't be afraid. It's still part of the journey. You'll be able to get something from this, but just be aware that as much as there's also a point in the steps where you need to actually even interview participants to collect their information about, to collect their ideas about what the skill should be or how the items of the skill should be structured. And at the long run, you still need to subject but keep in mind that it's really costly under development for over 2, 3, 4 years, and they're still under development. Like even from the Clcd's work, we collected data for over 2 years before we subjected the items onto data analysis, right? So if you are imagining a scale, I brought these memes here to illustrate my point that skills can be as simple as well as this, where someone can ask you, how do you feel today on a scale of SpongeBob? And then you have all these expressions, facial expressions of SpongeBob to illustrate a point, right? And these are simple ways to also capture behavior, feeling of action of a person. And if you go to the hospitals, in some hospitals, you have like a doctor has a chart on their wall, and then they ask, how do you feel on the scale of these 2 days? And then you can indicate how you feel, right? Before you get here, however, this scale needs to be validated. It needs to be subject to a lot of reliability testing, right? So before a scale then can be useful, these things need to happen, right? And so we learn a little bit about the steps today. So what are some of the examples of scales validation? Are familiar with it, but those sciences will be familiar. You also have satisfaction. This was also created by Dana and his colleagues, and it's very popular in social science as a skill to measure life satisfaction. We also have Duke's University Religiosity Index or Religion Index, which is really popular as well in the religious study of religion and measuring a person's responses to how how religious they are, right? So, Louder, can you mute? Okay. So another example of skill is also another popular one that came out 2 years ago, 3 years ago, is the fear of COVID-19 skill, which is really cited after it came out. And one thing I really like about skill, and one thing I really like about this skill is that it was created by a Ghanaian, it was led by a Ghanaian, and so it was widely used, and I really like that about it. I actually been used this in some of my publications, about 3 publications where this skill was used during when COVID was prevalent. Lastly, for public health, and also actually this skill is actually also used for other fields as well. Is the simplified medication adherence, which is used to capture medication adherence of persons living with HIV. Right. So these are just few examples of skills used in the social sciences, but there are a lot of them, a lot of skills, and essentially, if you are doing a research work and you want to choose from a skill, your mentor may tell you that it's advisable to choose from a skill as a skill, right? And then you need to actually even standardize a skill, but you can actually, as a researcher, also create your own skill depending on some of the gaps you've seen in research. Okay, so these steps are going to help you in this regard, but not necessarily help you in standardizing the skill, right? So what are the steps for skill development? Generally, like I said, I'm going to borrow heavily from Watten's paper, and I feel this primer is very simple, and everybody should go for and get it and read it. It's simple language, easy to read. You get to know a lot of all the jargons that scare people from knowing understanding skill development. He simplifies it very, very well, and you would enjoy reading it. So I'd encourage all of us to get it after this presentation. So according to Boateng, skill development can be aptly divided into 3 phases, and within these 3 phases, there are a total of 9 processes. Okay, so I'll take each of the phases and we talk about them, right? And also give us time, if you have questions, you can ask. Right, like I said, as much as this may be just like a one-time discussion, it doesn't mean that this is how these phases follow each other in this way. In some instances, can actually even move past some of the phases, and you still be able to develop a skill. And also, as much as I'm saying it in verbatim, like I said, it takes time for a researcher to be able to go over or cover all these phases. So keep that in mind as well. So in phase 1, which is the item development phase, we have these processes within this phase 1. So identification of domains, the item generation, and then lastly, the content validity. So we take the first process within phase 1. So identification of domains. So as a researcher, you are interested in developing a skill. First of all, one of the things you need to do is to think about what you want to develop. Why do you want to develop it, right? These are questions you need to ask, very pertinent questions. And another question that you need to also ask yourself is, are there no existing constructs that are measuring this existing skill that are measuring this construct, right? But before you even get there, you need to really define your domain. And domain essentially refers to the concept, attribute, or unobserved behavior that is the target of your study, right? So for instance, if you are in the Clcd's work, we're looking at stigma, right? Stigma was prevalent and mentioned commonly among mothers that we had interviewed, mothers of low birth weight that we had interviewed. They were all saying that, yes, when we take our children to the house, we have our neighbors staring at our kids. They don't come to us. They don't relate to us as they used to previously relate, because they think our children look like this or look like that, right? They were experiencing some stigma. So when we interviewed them, about how they feel towards their babies, these were the things they were saying about themselves, right? And towards their babies, right? So we're interested in okay, then are there any skills or are there any measurement tools existing in the literature that can actually capture these experiences of others? So we realized that there was nothing, right? So then that even propelled us further to want to capture this quantitatively, capture this attribute quantitatively, right? So, like I said, before you go on to creating a skill, you need to identify your domain, right? And identify domain can be done in several ways, right? You can actually be reading a literature, you can be perusing a theory, and then realize that okay, maybe this has not been done, or perhaps this has not been done amongst this particular group. How do we capture these attributes within this particular group? How is existing skills actually missing the point, right? What are the gaps, and how do I how do I create a skill that will fill this gap, right? But you always have to think about this, right? If there are already existing skills, why do you have to reinvent the wheel, right? In that stead, instead of creating or going to the trouble of creating a new skill, you can actually validate existing ones as well. However, when you feel that there's a missing gap where there's no skill like in CLCD's work, then you have all right to go forward and then create a skill, right? So, but before you do that, you have to define your domain. You need to define it to be all-encompassing, to be able to fully capture the construct, right? Leave nothing out, right? So this involves a lot of theory, conceptual framing. You have to consult the literature, you have to consult the theories. Okay, so what is stigma, for instance? How is it defined? What are the dimensions of stigma? Okay, so this is how I'm going to define stigma. What are the experiences that are generated, right? Related experiences that cluster around stigma. This is how I'm going to define it. And this is how I'm going to measure it. And then when you get your boundaries correctly, when you get your boundaries correctly, then you can then go ahead and you are then confident enough to know that you've identified your domains, you've defined your domains, and then you can go on to the next step, right? So what is the next step? Of course, the next step may be at the point where you've gotten to realize that, okay, there's no other scale in this world that is measuring this domain, or maybe there's lacking somewhere, and then you need to actually create it for the sake of this missing gap. Then you then start your item generation, right? There are two processes involved in generating items. You can do it in a deductive manner or an inductive manner. Deductive basically means that you're consulting the literature, right? Stigma is a prevalent phenomenon. Stigma is this. And if you look at the literature, there's an abundance of scales that measure stigma, right? There is an abundance of experience of stigma that are measured in different fields. So for instance, stigma towards mental health, right? As a researcher, I'm interested in stigma towards low birth weight children. It is right for me to then go and, for instance, go and look into the literature of stigma towards mental health or stigma towards any other phenomenon, right? Just to see how the questions are framed and formed, right? That would give me an indication of how then I should also create or generate my items for my stigma towards low birth weight children, right? This is a deductive process, which involves doing the literature review, looking at related literature that can help you actually in the item generation procedure, right? So we go to theory, we can go to literature, and then we can be able to do this, right? But this is also largely based on the domain. Once your domain is identified, then you can do the literature research. And by doing this, you are doing a deductive process, right? We are doing a deductive process. Stigma, like I said, is prevalent. So there are many skills that are developed for stigma throughout the world, right? So as a good researcher, you then have to then go to the literature and then that will help you actually generate your items. Another way is also the deductive process. This deductive process essentially is looking at the responses of individuals, right? So for instance, one way you achieve this is actually doing an interview or a focus group discussion. Then you present to your participant that, oh wait, I'm doing this, I want to generate items for to measure this experience, right? what are some of the items that you think are fit and be able to measure this construct or be able to measure this behavior or your experience. So in that sense, you are asking people the questions, or you ask them, you interview them, they help you generate the items, or you can interview them on just basically anything related to stigma. So for instance, there's Clcd work on low birth weight. What we did was that once we realized that many of the mothers were talking about experiences of stigma, and then they describe how they were experiencing stigma. This helped us actually generate the questions. Then we realized, okay, so when someone is looking at your baby in a particular way, right? Essentially, these mothers are saying that they are experiencing stigma when that happens, or when they hide their babies. This is also an experience of stigma towards them. So then through the interview, you're able to generate a lot of questions from that. You can also do this through observations as well, right? Where you observe behaviors, and then that helps you actually generate some items. Another way that during my master's program that we did it, we're actually looking at developing a tool that will measure attitudes or perception of selfie taking, right? So we are a bunch of about 30 students in the class, and then we have our professor up there. And then he said, okay, tell me what questions come to mind when you think about selfie and attitudes towards selfie. And then everybody started mentioning questions, and then we wrote them all on the board, right? This is also another way to do it, right? And because this group of people were knowledgeable about selfie, we were able to generate a lot of questions. So in the end, we generated about 44 questions, full of questions to that, in a sense, underline or measure the construct of attitudes towards taking selfie, right? The same process that we use, and the same process that you would use in generating items, right? But there are things that you should be mindful when you're generating items. One of the things that you should consider at this stage is that don't mind how many, don't hesitate on the number of items that you're generating. The more the merrier. So just go ahead and generate as much as possible, right? Because you've already defined your domains, right? You already know the boundaries between what fits into your domain and what does not. So that actually helps you in generating the questions, right? So then you can generate more questions. So in the end, when you know the definition, so for instance, depression is when someone feels sad. So now I'm going to develop questions that are related to sadness. So I feel blue. I feel pitiful. I feel like I've lost interest in life, right? These are all questions that are related to sadness, because you define depression as sadness, right? Or I cry a lot. Okay. So then those questions related to sadness then become pertinent to your domain, right? So then, but in so doing, don't hesitate as to what is correct or not. The more the merrier. It's important to think about this, because as you are going through the process, you are going to drop certain questions. Okay, certain questions will be dropped along the way, right? So you want the more questions to be able to drop even more, and then get standardized questions that would then fit the purpose, right? But if you, for instance, you start by only generating 10 questions, by the time you finish the process, all the 10 questions would have evaporated, right? And you would virtually be left with nothing, right? So generate more questions, 44, 25. In the instance of Clcd's work, actually, there's stigma scale, there are about 25 stigma scale items that were initially generated, right? In my experience in the master's program, about 44 were generated. In some others, there are about 100, 200, right? But like I said, whilst the process unfolds, you would delete a lot of the questions in the end, right? So the more the merrier. And also, this is also actually good for reliability issues, because when the more questions you have, the likelihood that you have very high reliability indices, right? Another thing you should also consider at this stage is the wording of the items, right? You want to avoid double barreled questions, items. You want to also avoid jargons, right? So here's an example for you for double-barreled items. So for instance, how is the taste and appearance of our pancake, right? If you give a participant or respondent this type of question, then the participant starts to think, which one am I responding to? Is it the taste or am I responding to the appearance? You don't want to create a question that will confuse your or an item that will confuse your participants, right? So rather than keep it this way, you can break it down to what is the taste, please rate your taste, right? Where the participants reading this will think about only the taste. And then another version will be, please rate the appearance, where the participants reading this will only think of the appearance, right? There are other things to avoid, but these are common knowledge you'd get. And I said, read the button paper, and then you get a lot of knowledge about how to avoid creating items that may be incorrect, right? The ultimate goal of item generation is to also actually create questions that are functional, right? That are clear, that are concise, that are anchored in such a way that reading it would elicit understanding, right? So as much as I am saying that create a lot of questions, you don't just have to let out any question just like that. It needs to be concise in a form that once you give it to your respondents, this respondent will be able to understand it, and this respondent would be able to respond to it correctly, right? So keep this in mind, right? Avoid the use of jargons as well, right? There are many examples of jargons, but for the purpose of stimulating conversation, I would want us all to put in a chat box. Just think of how a jargon, when placed within a question, can change the meaning of a question or actually create confusion, and then post it in the chat, and then we can read it out later, right? Whilst also generating items, you should also think about the response scale you want to use for your items. There's a lot of debate around this area about what is right and what is the right response scale to use, right? Some people say response skills less than. So generally, the likest skill type is used. So usually ranging from 5 to 7, they say is the most appropriate, and then ranging below 5, right, is questionable, right? So to be able to use it, I would advise you, or to know what to use or what is best to use, I would advise you to read more on the literature, and then choose a response skill that will be appropriate for your goal. Okay. But examples of a response skill is this. Okay. So strongly disagree. I know you've seen this countless of times. Especially for undergrad students who are doing their research, or even master students who are doing their research. If you've done any or responded to any social science research before, you would come across this notoriously popular response skill: strongly disagree, neutral agree, strongly agree. You see them a lot, right? So these are common. This is a common one, and I brought it here to illustrate my point, right? So, like I said, it's still debatable. It's still debated what type of response skills to use. But essentially, to be able to do a very good job, read the literature, then decide on what response skills to use, right? Yeah, using more than seven in the end to confuse your participant. That's one of the things. Like I said, you don't want to confuse your participants. So you want to use a response skill that would bear the little stress on your participants, but still give you correct responses. Okay. So like I said, read literature before you go ahead. But these are the three key things you should consider when generating your items. So in process 3, content validity. Content validity, also known as theoretical analysis, essentially is where you are like a detective going to ensure that all your items you've generated so far work, right? So this is a point where you consult your experts and also your target population judges, right? So your target population judges, before I come to experts, let me just tell you what target population judges are. Essentially are people who you've sampled from your population of interest, and you and may have actual experience of the phenomenon that is under investigation, and can give you deeper perspective about whether these items work or not, right? Experts essentially are scholars. So you can have like technical expertise, you can have those who are in the field doing research. So for instance, if you're going to do a scale on stigma, and CLCD's work, when we're doing the scale of stigma, we actually go to this point, we actually consulted experts and actually even interviewed some mothers who had reported that they had experienced stigma. Okay. So the experts we consulted, about 5 to 7 of them, they're all PhD holders. I'm not saying PhD holders are the ultimate, but what I'm trying to say is that we went to the experts, those who are doing work in that field. We asked them questions. We brought the skills, we brought the items to them, presented to them. Okay, so please, can you help us go through these items? Tell us how they form, whether they correlate with this domain under investigation or with this construct under investigation. And then you go over the items one by one with them, and then the experts may ask you or say to you that, oh, this item may not fit, so let's take it out. Oh, this item may not fit, or this item may fit, right? So that is essentially what you're going to do with at this stage, right? It's the same situation you're replicating for your target population, right? Where you interview them, you tell them, you show them the items, you cognitively interview them. And by cognitive interview, what I mean by that is that you would ask them, how does this item make you feel? What do you think about when you read this item, right? And then they give you that perception. Once you are interviewing them, then you are getting more ideas about whether these items fit or not, right? Like I said, once you collect all your 25 items, for example, in the end, or if you collect 50 items, for example, in the end, when you get to this stage, in the end, about 10 of them will be dropped, right? And the rest will be taken to the next stage, right? And the next stage is the phase 2, where we pretest the questions, and then we administer the questions, and then we then subject these questions to some statistical analysis. So the first stage, or the first process under phase 2, involves pretesting the questions. So now we have our questions. After content validity, we have our questions back. So let's say we started with 50 of the questions, and then we are left with, for instance, 25. Or no, we started with 50 and we are left with 30, right? So 30 questions, we are taking these questions for pretesting, right? And pretesting, like they use a usual jargon in social sciences, where you have a bunch of questions and you take it to a field, you only interview a small number of participants, you get the ideas, you subject these responses that they give you to some statistical analysis to see what is going on with the scale. You drop the scale, you drop some of the items on the scale, and then you go forward and administer, right? So the goal of pretesting essentially is to be able to detect which items are meaningful and which are not, right? After the content validity, then you subject to pretest. It also involves some cognitive testing. By this case, or cognitive interviewing, by this case, you are interviewing a little bit more interviewees. So if you started, for instance, in the content validity with, say, 5 participants in your target population, you are going to increase it a little bit, right? Research, there are some issues around the type of samples you use for your pretesting. Okay, so to be able to do that and do it very well effectively, you need to read around what sample you use. So for instance, if you are targeting about 500 people for the main research, where you administer the questionnaire or survey and then collect data, you should be targeting around 100 people or just a little bit below 100 for your pretesting, right? But in situations where the populations are hard to reach, then you have to adjust these samples, right? So the idea remains the same. You are presenting this reduced number of items from 50 to 30 to your participants, and then the participants will read through it. You can interview them. They respond to it, and then you get your data. You subject the data to some analysis, preliminary analysis. Then you see which ones to work and which ones do not. And that's the indicators will then tell you, okay, these items do not work, so let's eliminate them, and then let's focus on only these items. Okay, it also helps you also minimize misunderstanding and subsequent measurement error as well, because when you have measurement error, then a huge number of measurement error, essentially the item may not work in the end, or the construct may not work in the end. So you want to be able to reduce your measurement errors as much as possible, right? So this stage helps you in doing these things. Okay. Right. The next stage after pre-testing your questions, and after you've pre-tested your questions, and you've now settled on 25 questions like we did in a Clcd's work, then you administer the questions fully, right? So here you're then concerned with the number of participants or samples you want to use. You have to then recruit your samples. Ideally, you want to, the more the merrier. So you want to recruit as many as you want. There are some rule of thumb, like 10 respondents per item on the survey. So if you have 25 items, then you are targeting 10 times 25 is 250, right? So the more the merrier. You then in this stage also helps you doing some revisions to the pilot tested results, right? So for instance, after pilot testing, then you reduce your items to 25, then you take these items to the field, collect your data, you bring your data back, and then you subject it to further analysis. You can choose to do a cross-sectional here, or you can choose to do a longitudinal research here. But even if you employ longitudinal research, the baseline participants would be the participants you are collecting data on the first time to check to then you administer these questions to these reduced item questions for further analysis, right? So in this stage, just think about this as the research you do where you go and collect data on the field, right? Once that is done, you have your data, you enter it into SPSS or any statistical tool that test that you're going to use. And then the next step is to administer and subject them to the analysis, right? So the next process involves item reduction analysis and the extractions of factors, right? So how do we do this, right? And I'll illustrate it very soon with a little bit of SPSS, okay? The goal essentially of item reduction and extraction of factors is to identify items that are not or least related to the construct of interest for deletion, right? You want to delete redundant items, you want to do away with them, and then focus on only those items that are meaningful, or load onto factors that are produced from your statistical analysis, right? So to be able to reduce your items further, then you can check your item intercorrelation matrix to look at the correlations between your items. In this stage, you are targeting items that are less than 0.3, right? Correlates with each other at a coefficient of 0.3 or less than 0.3, so that then you can eliminate those items. Okay, those items that are highly correlated, right? Those are the items that you keep for further analysis, right? So in this stage, you're interested in actually keeping items, rule of thumb, that are 0.3 or that produce coefficients in the inter-item correlation matrix that are 0.3 and above, right? And then you choose from this stage, you choose your factors. The SPSS will produce the number of factors for you, and then you look at the factor loadings on these factors per the items factor loadings, and then you can decide which ones to drop or not. Okay, so let's turn ourselves onto Clcd's work so that I can illustrate the point from this stage onwards. So Clcd's work essentially was looking at the goal of the research was to develop a valid and reliable scale that will measure stigma that was reported by mothers of children with low birth weight, in fact, from a previous literature qualitative interview. So like I said, we did a qualitative interview, and then these mothers kept mentioning that, oh, they experienced stigma because they themselves don't want to touch the babies because they felt the babies were too fragile. When they go into the communities, people tend to look at the babies in a particular way, and then people who previously used to come and then associate with them, bond with them, didn't do that any longer because of the baby, right? So they mentioned a lot of things that indicated that there was a unique experience here that needed to be measured, right? So CLCD's work essentially, a goal was to develop a skill that would tap into this construct, right? So then we took this agenda on and then went through all the processes I've mentioned already, and then we recruited mothers, about 145 mothers who had given birth to low birth weight children in Kofanotri and also Kolebu. a mean age of 29.91. Excuse me. Right. So these mothers were recruited. They went through all the processes, the items were developed, and then we administered the items to them. And then we collected the responses, right? Alongside the 25 items that we administered to them, there were also measures of depression, stress, mother-infant bonding, social support, which were then used as indications to check validity and reliability issues, which we'll talk about in some few minutes to come. So the data analysis was done in SPSS primarily, right? So I would refer you to these two books, which are very helpful. They simplify the process of conducting exploratory factor analysis with SPSS, right? They are straightforward book. You would understand them when you read them, right? And then you know the process. But to give you a brief of the process I use in creating, to reducing the 25 items further into their respective factors, this is how I went about it. Okay. So the first thing I did after the data was entered, the cleaning of data was done, and then I was ready for the exploratory factor analysis. So first thing you do is to click on analyze, right? So you click on analyze, you go to dimension reduction, and you choose factors as indicated from here. And SB is just the short form of the item. So you can see about 25 items over there, right? Next step was to then choose the items. So when I click on these functions and then this dialog box open, the factor analysis dialog, exploratory factor analysis dialog box. And then I moved all the items into the variable view, right, as done here. And next step was to also choose my descriptives because I wanted to see some of the descriptives, right? But in also choosing the descriptives, I also chose, I wanted to also inspect whether these items were sufficient or suitable to conduct exploratory factor analysis with, because you need to be able to determine that, right? So in the indices like the KMO and Balesi test of ferocity were helpful. Determinants were also helpful. Significance and coefficients, correlation coefficients also helpful in this regard. Right, and also check the univariate descriptions where to give you the mean and standard deviation and what have you, right? Next step was then to check the extractions, right? With extractions, you can do it. So one thing I didn't mention is that factor analysis is an iterative process. So it means that you do it over and over and over again until you get the correct number of factors that you're interested in, right? Usually start with extractions that are based on eigenvalues, right? Eigenvalues just tells you the proportions of, for instance, the proportions of how the variance around the factors, right, contribute to the total variance, right? So you can start with 1, and then you see how it goes, how many factors are extracted, and afterwards, then you can reduce the number of factors to the desirable factor you want. Okay, so for this scale, I started with these extractions based on eigenvalues, and then later on, I realized that 2 factors were contributing largely to the variance, the total variance, and then so I changed my extraction to a fixed value of 2. Right. Also, for the purposes of also helping determining the number of factors to choose, I actually also use a scree plot, and I'll show you how useful it was. in a few minutes, right? So afterwards, I also went on to choose some items for rotation. There are two major rotations, and rotations essentially helps in interpretation, right? You want to be able to interpret the factor loadings to be able to say, okay, so all these items fall in this factor. So how do we then describe this factor? So for ease of interpretation, you use rotations, and there are two broad rotations parameters that are used. They are the orthogonal and also the I'm forgetting the last one. Okay, I'll remember sometime. But yes, I use an orthogonal. An orthogonal essentially assumes that the factors may not be correlated. The other one, which is not readily coming to me, assumes that the factors are, I think that is oblique, right? Assumes that the factors are correlated, right? So the underlying factors are correlated in the sense that when you take, for instance, the DAS, which is the depression, anxieties, and stress scale, we are assuming that depression will be correlated with anxiety, or the factor depression will be correlated with the anxiety, and anxiety will also be correlated with stress and anxiety. So there'll be some intercorrelation. So because of that assumption, we can choose to use oblique rotation, or if you're assuming that they are not correlated, then we can use a orthogonal. However, there are still debates in the field, but generally what standards of practice prescribe is that we start with with the assumption that they are correlated, and then see how that works. Once we know the results, then we can then change our assumptions and then use the right procedure, right? Like I said, exploratory factor analysis is iterative, and from the word exploratory, you should understand this. Okay, so the last feature I also chose in the SPSS, or I checked in the SPSS, was to also check the coefficient display, which is the options where I wanted to reduce the coefficients. I wanted the results to suppress coefficients that were less than 0.30, right? So what this means is that once each the items are rotating of the factors, right, or they are loading on the factors, items that are loaded poorly on the items which are lower than 0.0 are then eliminated or are not reported, and coefficients are not shown for those items. So clearly that gives you makes it easy for you to interpret and also remove those items that are not working, right? So this is just a brief interface of the SPSS procedure. So what did we find after doing all that for the low birth weight scale, right? So luckily the results of the suitability or data suitability shows that yes, these items were actually suitable for factor analysis. We had a lot of correlations above 0.0, which was a good indication that these items are correlated with each other and essentially correlated with the construct, which is stigma, right? And then we also had other scores, KMOs of above 0.6, right, which also go show that these items were suitable for factor analysis. Ballet tests of significance was also significant, which also indicated that the items were good enough, right, for factor analysis. So when we did a factor analysis, when the first results produced factors of 8, extracted 8 factors, which in total contributed to 63.18% of the total variance of the latent construct. However, and I didn't bring the results here. I should have done that so that you have a view of it. But however, the loadings were just haphazard, and we needed to clean the data up a little bit, right? So the first 2 items showed very good indication of better performance, right? So as you can see in the script plot here, right, items that are above the elbow, and you can see the elbow in this. Yeah, so this is the elbow, I think so, right? So items above this elbow show that, or factors above this elbow show that these factors are high performing in that, and therefore we should reduce these 8 factors into 2, so that then we can then be able to interpret our results, right? So by doing this, we reduce our total variance to 32.25, which is okay. At least ideally this is good, although we would want more, but this is actually okay, right? So we went with two factors, and this was actually helpful in deciding which items to drop, because some items didn't load onto these two, or didn't perform very well onto these two factors that we decided in the end. Right. And we also use Verimax rotation, because we assume that these factors are uncorrelated with each other. Right. So what did we find? So in the end, the 10 items were removed from the 25 pool that we initially had due to poor factor loadings and also low commonalities. And commonalities essentially talks about the variance explained on the per each item, right? So we want commonalities that are above 0.3. And as you can see from here, these commonalities are above 0.3, which shows that these items are sufficient or they are appropriate, right? And in the end, these two, after removing all these poor loading items and poor items with poor or low communality values, we increase our total variance explained to 45.92, which essentially says that these two factors explain 45.92 of the total variance of the latent construct, which is a low Berthelius stigma. Okay, right, which is actually very good variance explained, right, for the statistical widths here, right? So these two components essentially were, and if you look at it very well, each of the items, right, you can tell that we can describe these two components as what? Internalized stigma and also externalized stigma. So what I would illustrate this with by reading some of the examples, right? So for instance, you have an item like this. The way my baby looked, it was as if she or he looked like an animal, right? I thought that my baby was not my own. I thought that my baby did not look like a normal human being when he or she was born, right? So we assume this was more internalized way, because the mother or the respondent was talking about their experiences, how they felt, how they thought, right? And if you look at the externalized stigma domain or component of the scale, you think of items like this. I prevented some people from visiting to see the baby. I often stayed inside my room because of my baby. I delayed the outdooring of my baby. I felt happy to show my baby to others, right? So essentially looking at how the individual operates or relates with their external, people external to them in relation to their reactions or interactions with their baby, right? So this is how we eventually juxtaposed our factors, and these factors, or the results of these factors, were actually high performing. So we reported this as our final 2, right? So you can see that from items, we started from 50, like I said. After all the process of content validity and pre-testing, we reduced to 25. And then even after the analysis, it reduced further to what? 15, right? Because we took 10 out, right? So like I said, generate more items for the sake of being able to keep very strong ones in the end after all the processes, right? So what do you do next? Okay, so this is just about how the items are generated, right? Next, we would look at the third phase, which is the dimensionalities, which involves the scale evaluation, where you check the scale for dimensionality, reliability, and validity. And after telling you a little bit of this, and I'll present how we also did this, achieve this with Clcd's work. So then we'll continue the low stigma scale from there. So what is test of dimensionality? What does it involve, right? So ideally, after getting your factors, right, after checking your factors, you check for its reliability. the next step is to actually take these 15 items back into the field, go and collect more data, and then run some confirmatory factor analysis to confirm whether these factor loadings would replicate, or whether these items will actually load on these factors. Okay. Like I said, in some instances, you can skip some of the stages and report it, or with the idea that you would do it later. So in Clcd's work, we actually skip this stage because we want to publish, we want to be able to publish the exploratory factor analysis before then we do the confirmatory. So it's still a work in progress and you still get to that stage. But however, essentially, this process involves recruiting a totally different group of people and then administering these 15 questions that we generated to them. So we have to go and recruit new or more numbers of mothers with low birth weights, which is a restricted, limited population, by the way. So you just imagine the type of hassle you have to go through again. We would have to administer these 15 questions to them. Or even if you want, you can administer the 25 questions to them. And then we run the analysis. By this time, running it in confirmatory factor analysis, right? There are ways you can achieve this. You can use a lot of statistical tools. AMOS helps, is a fantastic tool that can be used for doing this. R, Stata, you can also use JAPS. Any actually statistical tool that is available can help you do this, right? But the idea is to check the factors. You match these factors onto a latent construct, right? Because then the confirmatory factor analysis, what it does is that it gives the ability to model these factors against latent construct. And in this case, the latent construct is what? Stigma, low birth weight stigma, right? And then you then populate it with the items you want, and then it gives you the response. And then you check whether these loadings are accurate based on some indications, right? So we have the RMSEA, we have a lot of others, chi-square, chi-square loadings. You want to also check whether it has very good loadings on that. But like I said, this is something you can read more about, and then you can get more information on. And I said, Barton's paper actually did a good job with this. So the next thing after this stage is to then test the reliability of your items, right? In reliability, we use several ways to do this. Two popular ones are Cronbach Alpha, and this can easily be done with SPSS. So you just subject all your items that you have reduced further. So from 25 to 15, you check the 15s, the reliability of the 15 items. You can do it as a total 15, or you do 7 and 8 per the factors that were extracted for you, right? Check validation, right? So you test the validity of your construct, right? There are several ways to validate your construct. Essentially, you're assessing the content validity, assessing the construct validity or criteria-related validity, right? And I think these are basic statistical knowledge, and I'll just read through this to show us what each of these mean, okay? So in terms of criterion-related validity, it helps us determine if scores predict future outcomes, right? And just like how it means, so for instance, you get your scores and then you would check again, you collect data another time, and then you would then do some regression to see whether it predicts it. You have very good predictive abilities, right? Content validity essentially determines the extent to which skills covers all relevant domains of the construct. Construct validity determines or examines the same concepts measured in different ways whether it yields similar results, right? So you have to do your check validity of the items. So validity also check with follow-up data. So it's important to actually even collect follow-up data to be able to check the validity of your results or your items, right? The goal is to be able to establish very high validity of your results to show that, yes, these items actually measure what they said or measure the latent construct they said they measure. Okay, you don't want items that are intended for stigma and then you realize that they are measuring depression or something else, right? You want them to measure what they say they measure, right? So once you run through this process, then you establish very good validity and reliability, right? And dimensionality, then you have very solid, a very solid scale, which you can then use for the field and use for further research, right? So how did we establish our reliability and validity, at least at the time, with the scale that we created with Clcd? So we use comeback efforts to establish internal consistency, and we realized that both internalized and externalized stigma, the factors or the domains had very high internal consistency or records of very high comeback alpha, which was largely above 0.7 threshold, which shows that yes, these items were reliable, right? We also run test reliability. Like I said, we interviewed a small number of the same participants that we followed in a baseline, and then we see not too bad reliability, although we would have wished for a higher reliability of 0.7, right? But of course, maybe problem with also sample undersampling as well could have affected this reliability, because in the initial data or in the initial sample, we had about 145 participants, and in the follow-up, we had about 50 participants, right? So that may have also actually reduced our reliability. Like I said, reliability actually also works with higher populations or higher sample size. So yes, not too bad, but we are hoping that once we collect more data, we will be able to establish very high reliability, right? So in terms of validity, we also saw very good indications of validity where we correlated the stigma scale with the measures that we collected data with, so depression, stress, the infant body and social support, and we see low to medium correlation, although we would have wanted a wish for very high correlation to establish convergence validity. Like I said, it's still an ongoing process, and we are hoping that once we get funding, we'll be able to do more statistical analysis and establish very strong validity. And lastly, discriminant validity. So we had a hypothesis that stigma would weakly correlate with infant sex or the sex of a child. And this was established and therefore established discriminant validity, right? So this is how we use the steps that I've illustrated to actually inform our research, and also use it to create our stigma scale. And hopefully when this is published, you will share with everyone else so that we have a feel of how the process works, right? So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and thank you all. And if you have questions, please go ahead and ask. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, we are here.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. You did very well. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge with us. Yeah, I personally, I was following attentively because I'm not really strong or good in quantitative methods. So I was looking at your presentation to get the basics and then try to maybe later on go and read more and then understand. But in all, you did very well. And then thank you very much.
Thank you too. And I'm sure this will be made available. I think the presentation, the slides will be made available to everyone who participated today. So then you can go back and make it as a point of reference.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Welcome. Are there any more questions, or should I take your silence as well understood?
No,
Hi,
no,
hello.
no, no. Hello.
Hello.
So mine is not a question, is an appreciation of what you have shared. And especially, you know, one of the major challenges that we encounter when we are starting our research is to identify the gap.
Yes.
Because sometimes it will take a long time for you to determine the small niche that you can also fit and fill.
Yeah.
So the aspects that you shared on the domain, using the deductive or inductive formula to determine where the gap is, I think it has been very helpful to me. And I think I'll take one of those methods, I think the inductive, to speak to a few people around the topic that I'm thinking about. And I think as they give me their views, I think from what I have learned from you, I should be able to position my topic, better. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, welcome. Welcome, Rose. Thank you. Yes, indeed. Those two processes help. And yeah, I didn't mention, but you can actually combine both of the process. Okay. So in our work, for this low birth weight stigma scale, we actually combine both of the processes, right? So we did a little bit of literature review. We went into the theory to understand all the boundaries and all the domains of stigma, and then we actually did an interview to also help us understand their experiences, and that helped us in generating the items. All right. Any more questions?
That's great.
Yes, yes, welcome. Any more questions? All right.
Hi.
Oh, hi.
I think I have my hand. Yes. So in the 3 stages of the skill development, in the first stage about the where you identify your domains, and then you do content validity.
Yeah.
There was content validity in the first stage, and the third stage is in certain situations. Can you skip the validity in the first stage, since because you end up validating it in the third stage when it comes to a skill evaluation point?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So like I said, this is an iterative process. So it means that some of the stages may actually you started with 50 items, and you go to your experts, and then you realize that all the 50, they tell you all the 50 does not work. Ideally, you have to go back and start all over again, right? So yes, you can skip it, you come back, you go back again, right? Until you get it correctly done. I hope I helped and answered your question.
Yes, please, Fafa.
All right, good.
Hello, Fafa.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was a wonderful presentation and impactful.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add on to this. In terms of the convergent validity, is it possible to also use another stigma skill just to find out as to whether they are related?
Yeah.
I think that would also make it much more robust for us to know that there's that sort of convergent validity.
Yeah, that is very true. You can use another stigma scale, but the problem why we didn't use another stigma scale was that we didn't. So, for instance, it depends on the target population. So, if it was a general population, for instance, a particular population that was suffering from stigma related to another thing, then you can then measure the stigma, right? Like it'd be relevant to. For this research, you didn't think of any other experience of stigma, maybe stigma towards something else could have helped, maybe medication or something, right? Yes, of course, we could have done that. But like I said, we thought depression and stress were more unique experiences, because these are giving birth to a low birth weight child is a stressful condition. Like it's stressful for mothers, right? If you work with mothers with low birth weight, you realize how much stress they experience. And you realize another thing, you also realize that they don't bond with their children very well because they are already afraid of the child, right? So we are hoping that maybe mother-child bonding would even bring that out.